Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar from wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hope everyone has had a good day so far or a good morning. We are going to be kicking off this webinar in just a second. Just going to wait for a few more people to join. Just wanted to get this started so people knew that we were here and that things were going to be happening today. So if you just give us a few more seconds, and hopefully we'll have a few more people join in as we see a flood of people coming in right now. Okay, I think that's good. I still see a lot of people coming in, so we'll let people get up and ready and get going with things. But welcome, thank you for coming and joining us today. So today's webinar is going to be on how to scale your QA team globally without hiring anyone. So I'm going to be your host, Fahim. I'm one of the quality consultants here at Global App Testing, and we also have Wojtek, the head of engineering at Global App Testing, on the call. Wojtek, can you hear me loud and clear? Yeah.
Okay, sorry for the interruptions. Welcome to everyone, and I'm happy to also share some my experience from the scaling the various teams.
Awesome, thank you, Wojtek. So as a very quick introduction for everyone on the webinar today, hopefully everyone can see my screen as it's flicked across. So essentially, as I was saying before, I'm passionate about helping companies, lead quality in their organizations. I've worked with a number of different companies, customizing and working with them on their quality framework, how they go about leading quality and putting together testing plans for your incredibly large companies and enterprises in the world, but then also for much smaller companies as well. So that's a little bit about me as I'm quarantined in my home office over here. Wojtek, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
So as you see, I do have some years of the experience working with the various teams, and from that perspective, if I look from a history, it always was about scaling the teams from the tiny one to the bigger one. And this is where my experience is coming from. This is what I will be sharing with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wojtek. Okay, cool. So I think that to give people an idea as to, what are we going to be covering in this hour session that we have. So this session is really going to split into a few different parts. So the first is around the difficulties that arise from hiring in-house teams, but also from, what are some of the challenges when it comes to scaling? Why is that a bad thing? Always people think about scaling in a great way, is growing your company, growing the number of people you have. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons behind that. The second part is going to be on implementing a scaling strategy. So how do we go about doing that? Part 3, we'll discuss a bit more about global app testing, a bit more about the market and how we work and how we've gone about helping companies going through that scaling phase. And then we'll also go on to a little bit of Q&A. So make sure you write down your questions and go and think about them throughout this webinar, so we can kind of definitely make sure that we get round to covering them off, and we can leverage Wojtek's experience, my experience, to answer any questions anyone on this webinar will have. Cool. So I think just before we flick across to the next slide, I'd love to actually just get a sense from people on the webinar right now, just who's here, who's coming in from different locations, where are you from, what's kind of the reason why you joined the webinar, what do you want us to talk about? We'll just give you 10 seconds to just write down a bit about yourself and why you joined, just so we can get a bit of interactivity in the chat. We never like making it a one-way interaction. We'd love to make it two-way where we can. I'll just give you a few seconds to write down an intro in the chat. I see lots of people typing away, so that's always a good sign. To read some of who we have on the call, we've got Caroline, welcome. We've got Paul from the UK. We've got Eugenius. Apologies if I butcher anyone's name.
I can help you with this one. That sounds like a Polish name.
Yeah, help me out on that one, Wojtek. Is it Eugenius?
Eugeniusz.
Ah, okay. I definitely wouldn't have got that.
Quite a good one.
Awesome. We've got David at the Testing News. We've got Gil from South Korea wanting to find out about how to go about scaling QA. We've got Tina from Slovenia and the Netherlands. We've got Stevka, Eric, great to have you guys here. Tanya from Ohio, Malin from Sweden. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing that, everyone. Keep doing that. We want to keep a good conversation going in the chat. Keep putting in any questions, any comments about this webinar that you're going through. Cool. So what's kind of been one of the big challenges with scaling? And what's kind of the big challenges that we see some of the companies out there facing at the moment? So while as we see companies going through scaling some of their QA challenges, what we see is that while developing and releasing and adapting your strategy simultaneously, one of the issues that we see with that is that while companies are growing their teams, that essentially is quite a daunting prospect, because while you're doing that, one of the biggest challenges is that you're essentially looking to release a rapidly changing product. But as you go about doing that, there are numerous challenges that come through with that. So as you grow teams, there are challenges around resources and allocating resources effectively. It's typically quite expensive as you look to build a world-class quality product to bring the right talent and the right people in-house. As well as that, it's incredibly time-consuming. So whether it be hiring the right people, to making sure you have the right processes in place to help them grow and to continue on the path that you aim to go through. One of the issues that we see there is that the expense and the time-consuming aspects culminate into it being really hard to go about justifying growing your QA team at scale. So typically when you have more complex software or higher volumes of software, we find that it's harder to go about justifying growing your QA team in a really linear way. And sometimes people have to look at more creative solutions as to how they go about growing their QA teams. Wojtek, I guess from your experience, when we think about scaling, what are some of the challenges that you feel come across when you're looking to scale engineering and QA teams?
So, from my end, it's not only the QA, because it's always that was the whole organization that needs to grow. So the growth and the scaling of the organization is driven by the set of the new projects or maybe new products that are showing up, and maybe there is a new customers that needs to be delivered the project on time and in a short time. So there are plenty of areas that are visible in scaling organizations within the engineering that also are impacting the QA. One of them is, like, of course, when you do have the set of the new people, the quality always drops because people do not understand how the current team was working, and they need to learn. The hiring is the challenging things. The bigger teams, the more the communication channels, which we will touch on later. On the purpose, I put here also the chaos, because the chaos, once you are bringing a lot of people, chaos will show up. Hopefully as an interim thing, but you would need to expect it at some point. The last but not least, I'm touching about the velocity, because it's when you hire 10 engineers or like 10 QA engineers, it will not that you will run 10 times faster. It doesn't go linearly. So there is always some kind of the overhead. I hope that we'll touch on this later in a more detailed way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit some really, really key points there from an engineering perspective, is that when we think about scaling teams, typically that might be an inverse in the quality of the product, because as you introduce more people, more chaos comes into the mix. If more chaos comes into the mix on the process, that sometimes means that quality ends up being compromised. So it's how do you go about introducing the right process as you go about scaling teams, which is typically a really difficult balance to get hold of. Cool, but I think that covers it really, really well. In terms of the next slide, it was actually going to be what we brought on earlier around getting people to introduce themselves and talk about their QA challenges here. But we've already done that, which is great. But keep putting in more conversations in the chat or more questions, and we'll be sure to answer them a bit later on as we go through this. So as that kind of sets the tone as to why is scaling difficult? Why is it a really challenging area? One of the common areas or solutions that people have is they look at hiring in-house. So when we think about actually hiring in-house, what are some of the difficulties and challenges that make it difficult to do this? So a few that we've written down and touched upon already. So one is about the scarcity of talent. Now, Wojtek, I know this is quite close to your heart on this point about the type of talent to get in, to make sure that you're bringing it into your company in the correct way and bringing in the right people, the right fit. Why don't you expand in a bit of detail here about why you were so adamant with me beforehand to put this one as number one?
Yeah, and it's like that starts with really what is the most important when you need to scale the team. And when I was reading a set of the books, and I will call out one, which is Work Rules by Laszlo Borg from Google. He truly say that you need to set high bar for the quality of hiring. That you always need to hire the people better than you and never compromise on this one. And I truly believe for those. And also, I would say the starting points. And then when you get into the process, you're finding out that truly everyone is fighting for those top talent engineers. So there is scarcity, and it's not the scarcity in the big cities. It's the scarcity around the world. And that's why the set of the companies are trying to go towards the remote work. And that leads to the fact, also the second element, the cost of hiring, because it's easy to make the one interview, but then you get the average, I would say, engineers and not very good process. So you need to invest high to hire the top talent. So the process is getting expensive, but in my opinion, that's the right investment. And last but not least is really to onboard the person very fast. My ideal world will be that the engineers will be put in front of the code in 2 hours from the moment he joins the company. We are right now at the metric of 24 hours, but still some area to improve. I believe 24 hours, so one day it's not the big deal. So we are in a good track. It's exactly the same on the QA side. So the faster the person really understands what this application is about, what the test case is, what is the regression suite, then the productivity can come. But you need to be prepared for 1 to 3 months of lower productivity that the person will be learning and relearning and trying to understand the edge cases, context, and so on and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about speeding up that onboarding process as much as possible, being aware that there's going to be a likelihood of a lower level of productivity as they familiarize themselves and build a context-driven view of the application. But it's just trying to speed that time up to value from an employee perspective as much as possible, whether that be deploying code, or whether that be finding relevant, insightful bugs or issues. And then based on those points there, the cost of hiring is a really, really big point. So as we think about just some stats that we pulled from looking at the World Quality Report and a number of other kind of factors here, the average salary of a QA tester at the moment is around or just over $35,000 each year. QA automation engineer, on the other hand, is the salary of someone of that field with that level of expertise and experience is around $70,000 plus. So I think a lot of this stuff is taken from Glassdoor. So I think not are we just taking into account the actual cost of the salary, but we also have to be thinking about the other areas from office space to supplies to the cost to train the new employees. At the end of the day, headcount's not cheap, right? It's always going to be a cost with numerous other aspects that are added to it as well. So from that perspective, it's really important to be thinking about those levels of values as we think and as we grow. So Wojtek, on this point about team size, as we think about scaling and hiring, let's say that we do take on the cost and we take on the importance of hiring someone internally. What one of the big challenges that we had discussed beforehand was around growing your team size too fast. So why don't you give a bit of insight into this from your experience on growing your team too fast or having, in this case, too many lines of communication?
True, and it's like the good exercise for everyone that for this is think through when you need to double your team. And what you will do at that time, and what you would do in case you need to triple your team or make it 10 times bigger. And there are plenty of challenges that needs to happen. And of course, once you grow it higher and higher, that you need to introduce the line management, and there are like sub-teams within your organizations. And one thing that we are touching on here is the more people you add, the more lines of communications are showing up. And in this tiny pictogram, you see the 5 people, and they already have 10 lines of the communications. When you will have 10 people, you will have 45 lines of the communications. So It is growing and growing. And I can 100% tell you a lot of stories from my experience that with my team, I was on the same meeting, and there were like 3 or 5 people, and out of the meeting, we get out with the various notes, and we have been still debating for 1 hour what has happened on the meeting. It sounds funny, yes, but that's the challenges of the communications that may happen. And the bigger the team, the bigger the challenges, that people have the different perspective. They look through the different lenses, different angles, I would say, for the same problem. So it's something that you need to be prepared to manage well from that side. One thing that I would add also maybe on top of this is communication is across the engineering and the software development. It is considered right now the biggest thing that we need to resolve to create the better products and the better quality products. And there are various practices going around it. So the problem is not everyone see this problem, but it is very, very big.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about having the right shared practices, and that gets more and more difficult as teams grow, also because sharing those practices and communicating effectively becomes harder as you grow those teams. As you mentioned, I think we discussed this beforehand, having 10 people in your team means there's 45 different communication channels, not taking into account all the different mediums to which you can contact them, from Slack to Teams to if you have to contact them via another channel, a project management tool. If you tag them in Jira, those are additional communication lines that we have to take into account as well.
Yes, and on this pictogram, it is only assumption there is always one, but it's also simplification.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you also told me about this concept beforehand about follow the sun. So obviously you mentioned it's obviously quite an old concept or traditional concept, more so in the waterfall time. But I think there's still some interesting value, or at least understanding that people can get, and insights if you were just to kind of touch upon this a little bit as well.
Sure. As far as I recall, the concept is coming from the IBM from the 90s, and it was meant to be solutions for the flexibility of the team and trying to ability to utilize the various time zones. So the concept was that the teams can take over the work, how they go around, how the sun is following around the globe. So the various time zones will take over the work. And in the software development and in engineering and the QA, it's always about the handing over the right information. So it's always about the communications that the one teams will be able to hand over the right where they finish, what is the thought process, what is the level of code, or even the test that they have been executing. And in this area, it has failed. It has failed from the concept that it's not possible to hand over the engineering work in a very good way. It is much better to organize it as the remote team or as a co-located team. Follow the Sun's concept is still alive in the support teams, but they have more granular work, and so each person will pick up the work and finish the work, and so there is no need for the handoff, because the handoff is the expensive team. And the modern practices like Kanban and Lean really trying to avoid the handoff as much as possible, because it is improving the productivity. Yes, so that was mainly where it was coming through, that really even having the different time zones is not resolving this ones. It is not giving you that much better flexibility, because still communication is the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Really well summarized there around the challenges for communication and how this perception that people will be able to have different teams in different time zones, and that's going to solve, or at least give them round the clock access doesn't necessarily work because that communication handover is still not going to be as smooth compared to if they had a more remote global team, or at least a more kind of on-demand solution per se. So having people in different offices doesn't necessarily solve all those problems.
Exactly.
I think one other area here that I mentioned around the hiring is very much about when you're thinking about scaling and thinking about growing teams. Whenever we've worked with our clients who might have remote developer or remote testing teams, there is always the perception that we have seen as well. I remember speaking to a story comes to mind. Spoke to someone last week who we work very closely with, a very large development agency out in the US. They had a team out in the Far East. They worked with that team very closely over their evening, which is the other team's morning, the Far East team's morning. They thought they'd relayed all the handover notes, the concerns, the requirements. What ended up happening is that they'd sent them a completely wrong document with wrong information in and weren't able to resolve that because they weren't at their desk. And so by thinking that you have a team who can deal with everything and make sure that the wheels are always turning, you always have to, nothing beats having some people in-house, but also just having a higher level of professionalism, whether it be an on-demand solution or something else. So those are some things that we always see whenever we work with certain clients too. Cool. So when we think about then implementing a scaling strategy and how to actually scale your QA team without hiring anyone. So what are some of the ideas that we have here that we've learned over the years that we are always willing to share and always have been sharing with our clients too? Before I move on to that, we've just got a question come in around, would communication be the same problem if you have your QA team external? So hopefully that story kind of touched upon some of those areas there around communication. But Wojtek, why don't you touch upon that and share some of your experience on having remote teams and how do you go about solving the communication challenge and problem there?
Yeah, sure. So that's kind of, we are touching on this in the next slides, because the communication is the challenge in all of the areas, and it's for the in-house team and the external teams. And it's always in the QA world, it's a matter of the clear responsibilities and the clear task base, like defining test cases, what the external person needs to do and what it needs to. So when you think that's really the biggest challenge is the handoff. So really how to describe what this person needs to do. And the challenge with the communication is mainly the challenge to pass the thought process. What's like, for example, the process of designing test cases, that might be very challenging to handle from one team to another. The execution of the test cases, it's much easier because assumingly it's the test cases are designed in a very good way. So it is just a matter to execute them and confirm is it passed or failed.
Yeah. Got it. Thanks for taking that question. So as we get to the first idea that we wanted to share with everyone on this webinar, it's about creating a quality culture. Essentially, we've got essentially a book that we've written called Leading Quality, and if you stick around to the end of the webinar, you may or may not receive a little prize for staying to the end around the book. In the book, one of the big sections that we talk about is called a culture of quality. And some of the practices around that fall into 4 different areas and pillars. So one is about people, second tools, third process, and fourth the actual culture piece here. So the biggest thing that we see whenever when we interviewed over 100 engineering and product leaders for the book, one of the big focus areas was having clear lines of responsibility. Now, those doesn't mean that those teams are in silos or only focusing on that area. There is going to be a lot of cross overlap between them, but having a clear accountability and essentially a success criteria for what does success look like for the team and for the product is always going to be incredibly important. Wojtek, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the people side and even the other areas here that we have on tools and process. from your experience, from what you've seen when working with people, and also developing a culture of quality as you've done at Global App Testing, and also from previous experience?
Sure, and it's like it's always when I'm thinking about the scaling the teams, it's for me also about increasing the maturity of the organizations. The maturity from a DevOps perspective, QA perspective, engineering perspective, because all in all, that's the end-to-end software development process where the QA is just a part of this. And here where there are some tips, like the continuous integrations is like a baseline that you really need to strengthen your tooling and having automated build and deployment. The very important practice is the continuous testing at cadence. And on the purpose, I'm stating here the cadence, because this cadence might be when you are just starting, it might be every iteration, every 2 weeks or every month. However, when you are more mature, you can switch to like testing on every night or every week. In case you are even faster, then you can test a few times a day, or you can test at every build. So that will be the most, I would say, on demand almost. And it's all lining up with really getting the higher maturity in the DevOps world, because ultimately what we want as the QA and engineering teams is to release faster, to deliver the product to the market faster, and also, of course, in a good quality.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you summarized it really well. It's about being able to release faster and on a much faster cadence. Like you said, that comes down to process, but also having the right tools in place. So the right tool configuration, the right way to be able to implement continuous integration, continuous delivery, being able to embrace automated testing is always going to be a really key element of that. And as well as that, you're just reducing the margin for human error. And then I think a final piece that you have on culture about cultivating internal champions. So one of the ideas that we talk about in the book on cultivating internal champions is having people who, from the bottom up, are thinking about how do we have a quality first organization. Now that might be down to organizing lightning talks in your teams about some of the quality practices that you've put in place. It might be having a shared lunch or shared lunch and learn, and being able to share some of the things that have worked in some teams, or some of the areas some of the tools that you've explored. So that can be done in a number of different ways. So as we think about one of the next concepts here, I think it really bodes well with, as Wojtek was saying, releasing faster and being able to shift. Essentially, you're looking to really shift left so that you know and can find defects as soon as possible. So Wojtek, why don't you talk us through some of the areas around being able to test fast and learn quickly, and some of the key principles people should know about?
So, it's like, as I mentioned regarding the DevOps and maturity models, and you can find set of the models online, I would say, from that perspective. Of course, when you want to improve your processes, you cannot focus on everything. So you need to maintain focus, and this path is the long path. And I can tell you from my experience, let's imagine that the 5 is the top. It was only in a few areas that my teams were capable to reach the top 5, I would say, from the process perspective, because there's a lot of efforts to make that happen. From a testing perspective, it's crucial to be agile and adaptable, because sometimes, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the testing triangle, so what to really focus on and where to augment the unit tests, where to augment it with the humans and the exploratory testing, and so on and so on. But it might be that you don't need to execute the performance testing because your product is still not there yet, that it's not the requirement. So being agile from the test perspective is also crucial to focus what is the most important in a current release, and also having the regressions to avoiding leakage and the defect leakage of anything that has been already developed in the past. Last but not least, I am very strong on continuous improving the software delivery process. So think through about the technology, infrastructure, monitoring, and all potential the tooling and anyone that you can leverage to have the better process. because scaling, on one hand side, things really change when you switch the number of 20 or the 50 people. There are various metrics. So you need to really reorganize the way you are operating and be capable to really uptake much more.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit some really, really key points there around prioritizing, and so focusing on a few things and doing them incredibly well. So I think that really comes down to prioritization, even from a product feature requirement standpoint. On top of that, being adaptable, because in an ever-changing world, as we are in right now, but then also from an ever-changing QA and developer environment, things are always changing, new features come up. It's important to adapt and to make sure that you're covering the level of risk required. And then from a process perspective, you talked about things such as regression testing and making sure that the key scenarios and areas have been covered, having the right level of infrastructure and tooling to support your team. And that only allows you to learn quicker and experiment faster, which allows you, hopefully, to release faster at the end of the day as well.
Correct.
So one of the other principles here is around being able to increase your test coverage as a driver towards continuous delivery. Now, I remember when we spoke beforehand, you were saying it's very much about if you increase your test coverage, it is a stepping stone to achieve continuous delivery. And it's one area or one component for people to think about and to focus on. So I just went back a slide. So as we then think about increasing test coverage as a driver towards continuous delivery, I think it would be great if you could just touch upon that area and talk about, okay, when we think about the DevOps and the testing and maturity model that are out there right now, what is important? What are some of the key areas to focus on? David in the chat has just mentioned, is it test coverage or is it code coverage? As one might be harder to quantify. Wojtek, what are your thoughts?
So I will cover those two questions. One is from Mattia, and the other one is from David. So from speaking to Mattia, what is the most important thing to increase the maturity in a QA? I would say the test coverage, because the reason beside it that the most important for the QA organizations is to prevent defects to leak towards the productions, to leak towards our customers. So, and the only way to make that happen is to really have the good, I would say, defense, good gate to really make sure that we release with the confidence. We'll touch on this with a few slides later on. David, to your questions regarding is it test coverage or code coverage? Unit test code coverage, yes, it is one of the metrics. But what we are speaking here is really the test coverage, because it's like testing only with unit test will give you one angle, and what we truly recommend is to look holistically, and the test coverage might include also the performance test. It might include the functional tests, and also exploratory tests, which are done by the humans. So there are like different various angles, and all in all, that goes with the whole test coverage. It is very difficult to calculate it, and to be fair, there are some tricks, but there is no known industry way to calculate functional test coverage, and also in a easy way, as good as we do have for the code coverage, because for the code coverage, it's a known metrics. Every language has the built-in tools, and it's easy to get the very tangible number.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess I can imagine there's probably different ways to work out the coverage and how many additional areas we think about across that. So I mean, I think that would be some of the key areas there. love the conversation going on in the chat though. That's super interesting across that. So I think one other area that we touched upon, Wojtek, and think about is also, in terms of having a scaling strategy, it's also vital to be able to build partnerships or at least work with teams and companies that can support you to increase testing capacity and volume and scale, but they might not necessarily lead to a large linear increase in having people or time or budget or even energy to think about hiring internal folks or contractors otherwise. So I think obviously, as a lot of people may or may not know throughout this webinar, we've been an advocate over the past 6 years since we started global app testing for crowdsourced testing, and so to think about it more from a holistic, okay, why are we suggesting crowdsourced testing as a way to go about scaling teams without having to hire additional QA individuals? Well, one of the big elements that we think about is about round-the-clock support. So, I think crowd testing companies, or at least scaling testing solutions, allow you to be able to test at any time of day. So having 24/7 support, because of the global nature of having professional testers in different markets all around the world. So testers essentially aren't working, typical 9 to 5 or Monday to Friday. It's being able to test 2 a.m. when you have an outage, or on a Friday night before you need to release for having a product whereby people use it over the weekend. It's being able to have that confidence to say that no matter what happens or when we need to release, there's always going to be a solution available for us to scale at that opportune time. Wojtek, I guess from your perspective, having round-the-clock support, maybe not so much even just from a QA perspective, but even from a development perspective, what has that allowed you to do over the years to be able to release on time and also release with confidence?
So that's really touching on the topic of flexibility that we have been discussing before. But one thing that I can share from owning, I would say, the infrastructure here in a GAT and also the product that we are, I would say, the building, the biggest traffic that we are getting is the Friday night. Because a lot of companies of our customers are testing with us or finishing something till the Friday, so by the end of the day, and they are handing over to us or to work over the weekend. So in a Monday morning, they can get the result. It might be various practices that are behind it, like a code freeze, and that after the code freeze, it's being handed off to and have the round-the-clock support. So 100%, it is good to, I would say, be able to utilize the perspective of around-the-clock support. So when you sleep, someone is taking over, which has the clear responsibilities that will do the job, and in the morning you will have the results.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat, and we will definitely come back to that. In case we miss anything, please feel free to put anything into the chat now so that we can get to it, or feel free to make a note for when we get to the Q&A section. I will also say anyone who has attended late or has just come on, don't worry about it. We're definitely going to send this webinar out today or latest tomorrow morning, depending on how quick our marketing team are. Typically, they're pretty good, so I'll probably say by the end of today, we'll get that over to you so you get the recording as well. So no worries at all. So one of the next areas that we think about associating and thinking of from a crowd testing perspective, from a scaling standpoint, is about freeing up your team's time. So freeing up internal testing bandwidth. And Wojtek, I know you had a couple of areas here around thinking about matching to the clear level of responsibility, but then also thinking about it from a quality aspect as well. So when we think about it from a crowd testing side, if you can have a team in place that can deal with some of the more repetitive tasks of executing test scripts or focusing on very specific areas of an application, that will then free up your team's time to focus on other more strategic testing areas or priorities of the product. And that could be down to further exploratory testing. It could be around improving the level of automated test coverage, a number of other areas across that, even from a cross-functional team working perspective, that allow you to do that. But Wojtek, I'd be really keen to hear from you on the freeing up the team side, but then also on being able to increase your team capacity and access more testers. What are some of the areas here that you think about as you integrate crowd testing or integrate scalable testing solutions into your framework and your method of working?
Sure, and on this point, I will start from almost from the end. What is our purpose of the engineering, I would say, department? Is to have we can oversimplify it, is to have the happy customers and happy users of our application and the product, whatever the users are. Is it the company or is it really just a consumer from that perspective? That leads to really to have the good quality product. That's correlate from the fact that it might be high rating in the App Store or any other outside applications. But really, to achieve this, you need to have the releases, continuous releases with a good quality. And this is where we are, I would say, getting to the point that this good test coverage and the low defect leakage, because I do believe the defect leakage is the most important element. By having more testers, you will get more logs, you will get more views, more eyes to test the particular applications before it will get into your users. So all in all, that's, from increased test capacity on the one hand side, you will get the more satisfied users. There are several steps in between to reach to this point, but ultimately that's the connections one in between, with this test coverage and the regressions in the middle, which is the most important element to execute before every release.
Absolutely, yeah. So having that fresh eyes and fresh perspectives, and therefore having access to more people, while being able to have increased capacity, can only increase confidence across that. Some of the questions I'm just going to quickly touch upon now so that people have some answers and we can delve into them a bit further in the Q&A section. So one I see now is around, crowdsourcing, does that include, or crowd testing, does that include internal and external resources? Now, when we think about crowd testing, one of the biggest aspects is being able to work very closely with a team to continuously evolve and improve on the results that you got on the previous test cycle. So every iteration should be improved upon. As well as that, a big part of crowd testing is utilizing external resources. So leveraging the crowd and leveraging a global group of professional testers who have access to the products and can test it from different angles and different perspectives with different networks, different devices, and a lot more. So it really combines the best of the internal and the external resources while also working with someone very closely. So typically we have a stellar account management team who work with all of our clients very closely and run workshops with them and very much align the quality strategy of what they're trying to achieve with the support and capabilities of crowd testing as well. But I can definitely touch upon that a little bit more at the end as well. The other question was around security measures. So how can we put the right security measures in place? Now, really that comes down to, for us anyway, I think from the beginning, ever since I joined Global App Testing, it's been pretty much the #1 priority that we focused on. So having a really robust privacy methodology in place, which I can definitely go into a bit later on, but that includes various IPs, various firewalls, access to very specific builds with a time frame as to when those can expire. Ultimately, though, it really comes down to the level of trust and relationship that we have with our testers. I was going to relay this at the end, but essentially, with Global App Testing, we have 30,000 professional testers that we've worked very closely with and have built very strong relationships with over that period of time. We actually go around the world and run hackathons for testers, or testathons, if anyone's ever heard of that phrase. We run them all around. We run about 70 or 80 to date in various places all around the world. We have teams jotting off all around, obviously not in this current environment, who build relationships with the testers. So all of these different aspects and angles mean that we build up a very high level of security capabilities with our testers. So hopefully that answers the question, but I can definitely answer that in a bit more detail later on. So I think one of the conceptions or misconceptions around crowd testing is everyone always asks, is crowd testing, I wrote a post about this on our blog at the beginning of the week, is essentially crowdsourcing the same as outsourced testing or outsourced QA? Essentially, it's not. So some of the reasons behind that, there are similarities, but essentially what we're doing with crowd testing is that we're essentially knowledge sharing between a number of different testers and also leveraging a group of people all around the world. So for instance, we work very closely with some companies who have testing needs in Italy, China, and the US. And then the week after, the needs have changed to Poland, France, and the UK. So being able to switch between different groups of professional testers in different locations to give you different results across specific devices and networks is something that you can't get with an outsourced firm. As well as that, while you can definitely build up a level of domain expertise, you don't really get the element of fresh eyes or fresh perspectives. So while we have someone who's always assigned to a specific client or customer of ours that can build up that level of domain expertise and experience, it's also important to have specific testers who have been with that client for a long time, but also to have new eyes and new people and fresh perspectives. Otherwise, you kind of fall into the same route as if you were just to scale an in-house team. So having that is really important, especially from an exploratory testing and driving a level of curiosity and investigation as well. Wojtek, was there anything you wanted to add on the importance or the differences between, crowd testing and outsourcing?
You know what? Maybe I'll touch base also on the previous questions from Eric, coming back to the security topics, because it's crucial. We do have a lot of process already, which has been described by Fahim that we do, and also we are investing very, very strongly in security. That everything is protected, encrypted, and in every channel, and tester has only exposition to the certain elements. It is crucial that we are building the product not only to be used, but also utilizing by ourselves. Last but not least, on our website you can find a few brands, and they are very strict and the requirements from a security perspective. Generally the internal team and the engineering team fulfilling all of them to be really compliant as much as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, the security and compliance aspects you mentioned have been crucial for us, and to work with a number of different organizations as well. And then I think a big part is at the end of the chat that Paul has just mentioned is around localization testing. So being able to test in over 105 different countries and getting a local level of context. So the type of insights that you'll get that if you're testing an app in French in France compared to in French in Sierra Leone or in Congo are going to be very, very different. So there's going to be some nuances from a functional perspective and from a usability perspective that can only be done in those specific areas or markets. As well as that, as I've already touched upon, there are now, especially on Android, there are over 30,000 different combinations of devices, OEMs, networks, versions that have to be covered. So all around the world. So as we look to test in really key markets, that becomes a big focus for companies there. So if you're developing a high quality product that performs as efficiently in France as it does in Japan, it's of absolute importance to be able to reach new markets and to carry out kind of rigorous localization testing.
One thing that I would add on top of this is exactly the last point, the cross-browser and the device coverage. From my perspective and engineer's perspective, incompatibility of the browsers and devices, it is really, really challenging. And it's like there are plenty of, I would say, the videos across the internet when it's working in Chrome, but it doesn't work on the Internet Explorer. It's getting better since the browsers are getting more modern and accept more advanced technologies, but it's still, it is the area to focus and to make sure that you test against what is your user base, what most of the users are kind of using the browsers and the devices.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So how can we help? So as we think about what do we focus on as a company and with global app testing? So again, just final touching upon this before we get into the Q&A here. For us, we're very much focused on delivering the best in-class functional testing and improving software quality without companies having to hire additional people or grow their QA teams. So essentially, we work very much alongside QA teams to increase their testing capacity by very much blending the best of crowd testing and people with automated processes as well. So companies can create, manage, edit, launch their tests, whether it be regression tests, smoke tests, functional exploratory tests, whatever they might be able to launch those tests very quickly in whichever markets that they want, on specific devices, on specific versions, and be able to get results instantly. So some of the testing that we have, the maximum turnaround time might be around 24, 48 hours, but some of the testing we deliver comes back within about 1 hour. So it really goes on to the point that Wojtek's been talking about, is if we can reduce the testing time but still increase testing capacity, it just means that companies can release faster and ship more often. We're now releasing solutions whereby results are coming back in seconds by utilizing automated testing. So by really combining a lot of these different aspects together, we're creating a much more holistic testing solution. Other areas I'll touch upon would just be 30,000 professional testers globally, covering around 10,000 plus device OS version combinations. And we're all with the goal of being able to respond to companies' development life cycles, no matter what type of functional testing you have, but giving you that availability 24/7, 365 days of the year, unless it's a leap year. So that's kind of the aspect and the scope of everything that we've said so far. But I would love to, I guess, just finally finish off by just saying that, if you want to find out more, if you want to understand more about crowd testing, what it can do, or even just generally have a chat about anything that we put in this presentation, feel free to reach out. And an email is going to go out with a webinar recording anyway. Feel free to reply to that, or feel free to contact either myself or Wojtek directly. So with that, I will close it off and ask for any questions. David, I hope you don't need to die onto another meeting. I hope that's dive into another meeting. Fingers crossed.
I see that there is one question from Mattia. What is the best solution thinking about process in order to scale the QA team? I mean, the test plan, test cases, test runs. What is the best solutions or the solutions that you suggest us to improve? From my perspective, is like thinking through these regressions, and where you're thinking about your test plan and thinking about potential us, how much of your test cases you want to hand off to us because they are repeatable. Where we are good with is really executing those test cases at scale and 24/7, and that's really very well scalable. So you can free up your team and to do any other work. Of course, we can also take over a side of the exploratory testing, and that's something that you can augment. And I would say always for every team, recommendation is, as it was mentioned on slides, continuous testings at cadence. So just keep it going as often as you can, because it will detect defects sooner for you. So you will not have to fix it on a higher environment, or maybe even not ever on the production environment. So that's, it sounds simple, but that's mainly, it's all goes into the increased test coverage and executing very, very often.
Yeah, gotcha. It's a really, really, really good points there that you've covered about as we look at scaling testing at volume and being able to do that at any time. I think that's really a crucial aspect to there when we think about how do we scale QA. It's very much about the volume and the I don't want to say the answer to scaling is scaling, but essentially it's very much about think about it as a multiplier. So if you can have more access to resource and availability, but not have to have them in-house or next to you on your desk or having to onboard them, then that can definitely be seen as a benefit. But yeah, really well articulated there, Wojtek. Yeah, thinking about any other questions, feel free to put them in. Just going through them all. What if there's software and a hardware combination of testing? So it's a question by Tina. Yeah, it's a really good question as well. I think it very much depends on how much of the capability from the hardware side could be done in a more automated or remote fashion in tandem with the software. So there are lots of clients who can enable their hardware device to work in a remote fashion. So they might not, the testers don't necessarily need the hardware, but there are others whereby we ship the hardware to them and they can receive updates to the firmware via the app or via the software. And at very specific times when they need to scale testing quickly, we already have testers with those devices or with those hardware components, with those IoT devices, and then the software and hardware can work in tandem. So in that way, we would just organize, let's say, a controlled crowd to be able to carry that out? So that's a really, really great question. Happy to answer anything specific on that after as well. Yeah, hopefully, well, I've got from Paul, interesting talk, spun on some ideas in the medium term. Great, really, really good to hear. Yes, I think as we look to almost close out there, if anyone has any other questions, I think we're almost out of time, so I'm about to wrap this up. Wojtek, is there any kind of last lessons or important aspects from this presentation? If you could leave the audience with one thing, what would be the one thing that you would say they have to remember from everything that we've spoken about?
I think I will repeat it for like a third time, but I will continue because I strongly believe it's so. Our one title of one of our slides, so to increase test coverage, and that this is driver towards continuous delivery. So something that every team, every engineering team dream of and want to get, and it's a long path. So just when your QA teams needs to focus on one, just increase the test coverage.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you very much, Wojtek. Thanks for joining me as well. I'll just leave this up in case people want to connect with us. Around leading this book to anyone. It's been a long time for us to go about writing, but we have developed some great content and always love talking about it and sharing more information about how do you lead quality in your organizations. And if anyone who's still around, please feel free to take a snap of this or scan the QR code, get your free copy of the book. It will be sent after as well, but essentially this is a lot of lessons learned over the years and interviewing a lot of people. So this is kind of a thank you to the QA community and the world of DevOps and QA ops for all the learnings that we've gathered around that. But yeah, thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you Wojtek as well for joining me on this webinar too.
Thank you very much, and you're welcome. It was a pleasure to speaking here.
Cool. Thanks very much everyone. Take care. Have a great day.
Bye.